And we're finally at our final presentation, which historically we always have the same person who speaks last for us, Brenda Bouchette. And there was some joking with her about how she always closes off the conference and how, she's really the closer, I guess you could call her, right? And she pointed out that the reason this came to be was that Brenda used to work for ABC Communications, and Bob would try to fill all the vendor speaking slots, but no vendor actually wanted the very last speaking spot. And not that Brenda wanted it either, but she used to work for Bob, so Bob could say, "You're doing the last spot," and that's what Brenda would get. Now Brenda no longer works for Bob, but she's so traditionally the closer now that we're still bringing her in. So thank you, Brenda. So Brenda now in her new role as the technical and economic advisor at Tacit Law, and she's going to give us her annual ISED Spectrum update. And a little bio on Brenda. She's a professional engineer with 26 years experience in the telecommunications industry. Brenda's designed fixed and mobile networks across Canada and internationally for large carriers and small operators. She has extensive knowledge of telecommunications network designs and business challenges facing network operators. She's also well-versed in economics and its application to the telecommunications industry. She authors submissions to ISED consultations and CRTC proceedings related to telecommunications policy, spectrum auctions, wholesale access, funding programs, digital connectivity, and works with clients to define and refine positions. Brenda, I'm going to bring you up on that, and welcome, Brenda Bouchette. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. This has indeed become my favorite speaking slot ever. So my name is Brenda Bouchette. I'm with Tacit Law. I'm going to speak today about my favorite subject, that is spectrum, and in particular, I'm going to talk about the last 3 gigahertz spectrum auction that was held in 2021, and the next 3 gigahertz spectrum auction that we anticipate maybe in 2023. So next slide, please. Before I get into the next spectrum auction and the outcomes of the last spectrum auction, I'll go through a few points of background, and you're probably already familiar with these ideas, but they're important to understanding how the spectrum auction worked and to understanding the outcomes of that auction. I'll talk about how we express spectrum prices, I'll talk about set-asides, and I'll talk about the difference between service areas, products, and licenses. With that out of the way, I'll talk about the prices that we saw coming out of the last spectrum auction and the bidding patterns that led to those prices. And finally, I'll talk about the next spectrum auction, what we can learn from the last and what we can perhaps expect from the next. Next slide, please. So we talk about, the first piece of background is how we express spectrum prices. And there's 2 ways that we talk about a spectrum price. We can talk about a license price, or we can talk about the unit price or the spectrum price or the price per megahertz per population. And I'll use an example. I'll talk about Toronto. In the Tier 4 service area of Toronto, in the last spectrum auction, a 10 megahertz spectrum license cost $194 million. That was the price that the winning bidder bid in the last round of the auction, and that's what they paid, plus any assignment round price. And I'm going to ignore the assignment round prices today because they're quite small relative to the license price. The population of Toronto is about 7 million people. Of that service area, it's about 7 million people. So the unit price, or the spectrum price, is $194 million divided by 10 megahertz divided by 7 million people is $2.77 per megahertz per pop. Compare that to a license in Brandon, Manitoba. In the last spectrum auction, a 10 megahertz license in Brandon, Manitoba, Tier 4 service area cost $2.8 million. The population here is about 104,000 people. So $2.8 million divided by 10 megahertz divided by 104,000 people, that's $2.77 per megahertz per pop. The license price in Toronto was much higher than the license price in Brandon, Manitoba, but the spectrum price per megahertz per pop was very similar. Generally, the license price is higher when the population of the service area is higher. So when we talk about spectrum prices, we usually want to compare the spectrum price across different service areas. So we usually talk in terms of price per megahertz per pop. Next slide, please. The next piece of background is set-asides. And you're probably already familiar with the concept of a set-aside, but it's important to understand what set-aside spectrum is and what open spectrum is not. And to describe this, I'll use an example. Imagine that today the conference organizers did not order enough sandwiches for lunch. There's not enough lunch food for everybody. In order to deal with this, the conference organizers decide that they're going to auction the lunch sandwiches. People who are more hungry will be more willing to pay a higher price for the sandwiches. So the sandwiches will be allocated to the people who want them most. This makes a whole lot of sense. So they set up the sandwiches on a table. There are roast beef sandwiches, ham and cheese sandwiches, and egg salad sandwiches. And the conference organizers are approached by a delegation of young people asking for preferential access to sandwiches. They have compelling arguments. Young professionals are less likely to be able to afford high sandwich prices. Young people's nutritional needs are important. The conference organizers are convinced, and so next slide, please. The conference organizers put out a table, and they put some of the sandwiches on this second table. These sandwiches are set aside for people under the age of 30. If you're under 30, you're set aside eligible. If you are under the age of 30 and you place a bid on a roast beef sandwich, that bid is automatically placed on a set-aside roast beef sandwich. And if you're over the age of 30 and you place a bid on a roast beef sandwich, that bid automatically goes on an open roast beef sandwich. Those sandwiches on the original table are called open products. So if you are ineligible for the set-aside, if you're over the age of 30, you can only bid on the open products. And if you're under the age of 30, you can only bid directly, that's an important distinction, on the set-aside products. So in effect, there's two separate auctions happening simultaneously. There's a set-aside auction and an open auction. But these two auctions interact in a few different ways. The first way these auctions interact is that ISED usually sets up spectrum auctions so that the price of an open product is never less than the price of the equivalent set-aside product. Imagine, if you will, that young people, for some reason, are particularly fond of ham and cheese, and old people don't like ham and cheese very much. What's going to happen in that scenario is that the open ham and cheese product, the bidding for that product, is going to end fairly early in the auction and settle it at quite a low price. But the bidding for the set-aside ham and cheese product is going to keep going, and the price is going to go up. And as the price goes up of the set-aside ham and cheese, that pushes up the price of the open ham and cheese sandwich. That brings us to the second way these two auctions interact. As the price of the open sandwich is pushed up by the price of the set-aside bidding on the ham and cheese sandwich, open bidders will reduce their demand for ham and cheese sandwiches. And when that happens, the set-aside bidders are going to win some of the open product. So while set-aside bidders cannot bid on open product, they can win open product. Open bidders cannot win set-aside product. The next slide, please. The third way these two auctions interact is, imagine that the conference organizers have a small number of turkey sandwiches. There's not enough turkey sandwiches for an open product and a set-aside product. So they put these turkey sandwiches on a third table. Anybody can bid on these turkey sandwiches. They are open to all. ISED doesn't have a name for them, but I'll call them open to all. In the last spectrum auction, there were a number of service areas where companies had existing licenses that were grandfathered. And in those service areas, there were very few licenses available, and they were typically auctioned as open to all. In the next auction, this is not going to feature very prominently, but it's important to understanding the results of the last auction. Next slide, please. The last piece of background I want to go through is the distinction between a service area, a product, and a license. And this is important mostly because I mix them up all the time, so at least you can be clear on them. As an example, Canada is divided into 172 Tier 4 service areas. In the last auction, those 172 service areas had 353 products, and across those 353 products, there were 3,440 licenses for sale. As an example, let's look at the Tier 4 service area here surrounding Quebec City. This is a single service area, one service area. In that service area, there were 3 products for sale. There was an open product, there was a set-aside product, and there was an encumbered open-to-all product. Encumbered means there's an existing user in that service area in some of the blocks that needs to be protected. Across these 3 products, there were 14 licenses. There were 7 open licenses, 5 set-aside licenses, excuse me, and 2 open-to-all licenses. So thank you for sitting through this bit of background with me. I know it's a bit tedious, but it's important to understanding how the auction works. So next slide, please. Let's look at the prices that came out of the last auction. Licenses in the last auction sold for between $5,700 and $194 million. The vast majority of licenses were 10 megahertz licenses in a single service area. There were a few exceptions. I'm going to ignore them today. Most products sold for between $100,000 and $5 million. Set-aside products were a bit more likely to be cheaper, to $100,000 to $500,000. Open products were more likely to be more expensive, $1 million to $5 million. In the next slide, please, let's look at the same data, but in terms of price per megahertz per pop. Half of the licenses sold, or half of the products sold in the last auction were less than $1.25 per megahertz per pop. Again, set-aside licenses were more likely to be below $1 per megahertz per pop. Open licenses were more likely to be more expensive, $2 to $5 per megahertz per pop. The products that sold for $7 to $10 per megahertz per pop were almost entirely open to all products. In fact, in next slide, please, of the 10 most expensive products in this spectrum auction, all but 1 were open to all. Remember, that means there's very few licenses available. And 7 of those products were in Quebec. So next slide, please. Let's look at some of the bidding patterns that led to these high prices. And looking at bidding patterns, next slide, please. We'll start in Vancouver because that's where we are today. In Vancouver, there were 2 products for sale, an open product and a set-aside product. The charts show for each of these products, the demand expressed by each bidder in each round of the auction, color-coded by company. And the black line shows the supply of licenses for each product, so the number of licenses available in that product. In the top graph, that's the open product. You can see Rogers in red, TELUS in purple, and Bell in blue bidding for the 9 licenses available. And in the end, Rogers wins 4, TELUS wins 3, Bell wins 2. In the set-aside bidding, we see Videotron in gold and ExploreNet in blue, bidding for the 5 licenses. Bidding here wasn't particularly competitive. This was typical across most of southern BC and to a lesser extent in Alberta. The bidding for the set-aside license was not terribly competitive. And I would guess that that's because Freedom Mobile was not participating in this auction. You can see in a few places here that Videotron is expressing a demand for more licenses than there are available. That's because Videotron is effectively bidding against Bell, Rogers, and TELUS. They're trying to win open licenses. They're trying to push Bell, Rogers, and TELUS out of their licenses. Of course, they fail, and Videotron wins the 5 licenses. Let's compare that, next slide please, with the bidding in Toronto. And in Toronto, there were 3 products available, an open license, a set-aside license, and an open-to-all license. Once again, in the open license, we see Bell, Rogers, and TELUS bidding with with Rogers and TELUS winning the open licenses. In the set-aside bidding, we have a lot of bidders. We have Videotron in gold, once again expressing a demand for more licenses than there are available. Cogeco in dark blue, TerraStar in light purple, and ExploreNet, in light blue, expressing a little bit of demand, but not terribly dedicated to winning spectrum in downtown Toronto. In the end, Videotron and Cogeco are winning spectrum in Toronto. And in the open-to-all license at the bottom, everybody bids, and Rogers and Bell end up winning those licenses. So let's look at, next slide please, the bidding for the most expensive product in the entire auction. This is a license in Victoriaville, Quebec, which is in the eastern townships, roughly between Montreal and Quebec City. Bell and Rogers, of course, are bidding for this license. That's in their core service areas. Xplornet in light blue is interested in licenses in Victoriaville, but they don't hang around for all that long. Sojatel in light green and Videotron in gold are bidding very competitively on these licenses. Victoriaville, Eastern Townships of Quebec, is in the core operating territory of these two companies. They really want spectrum in Victoriaville. Sojatel holds out until round 44. Videotron keeps going until round 55 or something like that, as the price approaches $10 per megahertz per pop. And in the end, only Rogers and Bell have the stomach to pay that kind of price for spectrum. Let's contrast this bidding with, next slide please, the bidding in Skeena. Now in both Victoriaville and Skeena, there are only 4 licenses available. Remember, in Vancouver, in Toronto, in both of those cities, there were 14 licenses available. Here, there's only 4. In Victoriaville, we had a lot of bidders who wanted those 4 licenses. In Skeena, we have Rogers and Telus, and once again, we have Videotron and Xplornet bidding, with City West bidding in the first couple of rounds. But Videotron and Xplornet are just not as dedicated to win spectrum here as Sojatel and Videotron were in Victoriaville. It's perhaps not where they're planning on deploying. It's perhaps not in their core operating territory. So the price is not driven up nearly so high. And again, they drop out of the bidding. Rogers and Telus win the spectrum here at about a quarter of the price that the spectrum went for in Victoriaville. In the most expensive, in northern BC, we see the same bidding pattern actually. In most of northern BC, there were relatively few licenses available. They did go to the major carriers, but the prices weren't extraordinarily high. In the 10 most expensive service areas, we saw very similar patterns to what we saw in Victoriaville. A lot of competitors wanting the spectrum, and those competitors are very, very dedicated to winning the spectrum. But in general, across Canada, set-aside bidders were not able to win spectrum off of Bell, Rogers, and Telus. They could not compete with those major carriers, except, next slide please, in Saskatchewan. SaskTel in brown is, of course, dedicated to winning spectrum, all the set-aside spectrum, in their core service area in Saskatchewan. We see SaskTel's bidding is unrelenting. Xplornet is also very dedicated to winning at least some spectrum in Saskatchewan. And between them, these two bidders drove Rogers to reduce their demand. Because this spectrum was won off of Rogers, the set-aside price and the open price is the same at $5 per megahertz per pop. This is quite high for open spectrum. It is extremely high for set-aside spectrum. I don't think there was set-aside spectrum that went for this price anywhere else. And it was SaskTel and Xplornet that drove the price so high, and that was throughout Saskatchewan. Let's look at one more price outlier. Next slide, please. And that is Golden, British Columbia. As with most of southern BC and Alberta, the bidding in Golden was not horribly competitive. Videotron and Xplornet both won spectrum here at a very reasonable 67 cents per megahertz per pop. In the open bidding, however, Telus spent $7.16 per megahertz per pop, which is extremely high for an open spectrum. And that's because of the bidding of Star Solutions, shown here in light sort of taupe or something. Star Solutions bid on a number of different service areas throughout the course of the auction. They ended up winning, I believe, one license in Lloydminster. Based on that bidding pattern, I would guess that they're behaving as an opportunistic bidder, perhaps out for a deal. And I don't know what they were doing in Golden. Maybe they were parking their points in Golden, waiting for the auction to kind of settle out, for prices to settle down, so that they could jump at the end of the auction onto a relatively low-cost spectrum. I don't know, but for whatever reason, for whatever their motivation was, Star Solutions drove Telus to pay an extremely high price in Golden. Next slide, please. So we start to see a pattern emerging where there are very few licenses available, where there are a lot of where there are a lot of competitors wanting to bid for that spectrum, and where those competitors are highly motivated. This is classic low supply, high demand scenario. We see very high spectrum prices. Next slide, please. So what do these prices mean for the next auction? What information can we draw out of this for the next auction? Next slide, please. The next auction is going to be quite similar to the last auction in structure, but there are a few key differences. And one difference is the amount of spectrum that's going to be available for sale. In the last spectrum auction, most service areas had between 70 and 100 megahertz of spectrum available for sale. Those are the two highest bars representing the number of licenses, a number of service areas with that number of licenses available. Sorry if you can't read the small print at the bottom. Many service areas had more than 100 megahertz of spectrum. A few service areas had more than 150. Many service areas, that is on the far left-hand side, you see that medium height bar, had 30 or 40 megahertz of spectrum available only. In the next auction, there's going to be 250 megahertz available for sale. With a significant increase in supply, if demand remains the same, that's a very big if, we would expect to see lower prices in the next spectrum auction. Next slide, please. The other difference in the next spectrum auction that we anticipate is that ISED may impose a spectrum cap. This isn't for sure yet because ISED hasn't published the rules for the auction, but in the consultation, they floated the idea of a 100 megahertz spectrum cap that would apply to both the 3500 band and the 3800 band. If that spectrum cap is applied, then companies that hold licenses coming out of the last auction would be limited in how many licenses they can bid on in the next auction. And that has some pretty significant implications. In Vancouver, for example, Bell, Rogers, TELUS, and XploreNet hold spectrum, between them 200 megahertz of it. So in the next auction, if there's a 100 megahertz crossband cap, those companies between them would be able to bid on a maximum of 200 megahertz, leaving 50 megahertz for everybody else. XploreNet bid on spectrum in Vancouver in the last auction, and we can see at what price they dropped out. So we can guess how highly XploreNet might value spectrum in Vancouver. And we can perhaps guess then what price we might have to pay in order to win spectrum against XploreNet in the next auction. In Skeena, for example, Bell, Rogers, TELUS, and XploreNet hold spectrum. And again, there's going to be 50 megahertz left over for somebody else. So in the next auction, if Videotron was bidding, so we may be looking at bidding against Videotron for some spectrum in Skeena. Next slide, please. So there's a lot that we don't know. We don't know how highly the winning bidders valued the spectrum that they won in the last auction. Maybe they would have been willing to pay more. But we do know how highly the not winning bidders valued the spectrum they did not win in the auction, because we can see at what price they dropped out of the bidding. We don't know if companies, our competitors, have overall budgets for the auction. Companies have shareholders have sentiments. Those may change from one year to the next, and those will influence whether a company has a budget. And some companies bid very much in the last auction as though they had a budget. Companies may have bidding objectives that override budgetary considerations. As we saw with SaskTel, their bidding was unrelenting. Regardless of the price increase, they kept their demand static through most of the auction. So the only concrete advice I have for you going into the next auction is don't bother to bid against SaskTel. So as we go into the next auction, we actually have a lot of information. We know you can look at your service area today. You can look at who bid you can look at who owns spectrum. You can look at who bid in the auction, in the last spectrum auction, pardon me. And once ISED publishes their final auction framework, you can look at the size of the set-aside, the size of the spectrum cap, and you will have a good idea of who you'll be bidding against. Next slide, please. So Thank you for the opportunity to talk about my favorite subject. Stay tuned for the next spectrum auction, for the ISED to publish the rules of the next spectrum auction. And of course, don't hesitate to talk to me if you have any questions. I will add, if you're asking questions about spectrum auctions, you can ask any question you want to anybody up until ISED publishes the framework for the spectrum auction. At that point, the list of questions you can ask kind of shrinks. And at the date that the deposits are due, the list of questions you can ask someone goes down to approximately 0, because a consultant is only allowed to have one client in a spectrum auction. So if a consultant has a client in the spectrum auction, they can't talk to you about anything. So you have to be very careful about who you're talking to about in spectrum auctions, who you're asking questions of, and when you're asking those questions. So if I have a bit of time for questions, I can take a question. Room's thinned out. We're getting close to the end. The spectrum auctions are so exciting. They're just, it's all handbags in there. It's just every company for themselves, and the auctions are very, very exciting. And yes, I said during the auction, this information is not available. You don't know who's bidding on what. But after the auction's done, after some delay, ISED publishes every bid by every bidder in every round of the auction. So there's a lot, it's a very information-rich environment. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brenda. Yeah, thanks for the sandwich analogy. Actually worked. I was like, I've heard you explain how the set-asides work and everything, but that was the best real-world analogy. To take something extremely complex and break it into food was great. Okay, well, we're here at the end now. I'm going to let Bob come up and close the conference. Just one piece of housekeeping. If you want to just leave your lanyard and your name tag at the front desk, we can reuse it in future conferences. So better than taking home and throwing in the garbage. So thanks, everybody. I had a blast. Great seeing everybody. And hopefully see you all back here in about a year's time. And I'll hand it over to Bob.
I'd like to see if I can get a hand for the people that helped me pull this off. Chris Allen, Brenda Bouchette, Curtis Chang, and James Van Dam, our AV guy who struggled with all this technology. Way to go, James. So thanks for all you guys for hanging around here to the end of the show. And it's been a great conference. I'm glad that we pulled it off again this year. And I really appreciate all the support from the sponsors who came from all over Canada and the US to support us here. And it shows our industry still alive and well. And, you know, it's my cause going away from here, of course, is to try to get the government to give the little guys a better chance at things. And I was very pleased the CRTC people came to listen to us today. That was a first for our organization. And I hope you guys will all come back next year. I didn't get any questionnaires made up this year, so you don't have to fill out the questionnaires. Just come next year. Okay? All right. All right, thanks everybody. And